Another very important role of government is solving the asymmetric information problem. We talked about this in a previous video, where somebody knows something that's important and you're trying to buy something from them and they don't tell you, right? And so that's a problem. So the government can play a role in ensuring that full information is disclosed. And we see this in things like the nutrition information on the back of food. We see it in the enforcement of real estate contracts, things like that. Government can play a role in solving the public goods problem. So we talked about the public goods problem. This is the problem where you get free riders, and so certain products aren't produced because there's no way to get paid for it. Well, government does that through patent law. Government does that through copyright law and trademark law. Government can also do it for things like the military by forcing everybody to pay taxes. Let's suppose that we're a bunch of farmers and we live in a little valley, and running through our valley is a stream of water that sometimes becomes a river of water, maybe every 3 or 4 years. And when it does, it comes over the banks of the river and wipes out all of our crops. We don't like that. No. And so we get together, 30 of us, and we discuss this and we come up with a solution. Let's each put up a little bit of money and build a dam upstream to make sure that the river flows at a constant rate. We need the water. We need the water for our crops. We just don't like it wiping them out. So we'll build this dam and we'll have nice steady water year in and year out. Well, on the way home that evening, some of the people start thinking, wait a minute, if I don't put in my $50,000, they're still going to build it. And I get all the benefit. I can free ride. Well, what happens if enough people do that? They don't build the dam. And the losses continue for year after year. So the government can come in and say, we're going to build this dam, and you're each going to pay $50,000, period. And we're going to take it out of your property tax or whatever, and you're going to pay for this. And the dam gets built. Another role the government can play is helping to address other negative externalities. So we've talked about this before. A negative externality is when the producer of a good or service does not internalize the full cost of their production. That means they're imposing costs on other people. When we have a negative externality, there's a cost that creates a deadweight loss. This could be something like pollution, for example. So the government can come in and say, we're going to solve this problem. Now, they can solve this problem in a number of ways. And one way to do it would be through regulation. So they could say, we're going to regulate how you produce your goods, and you're going to have to put scrubbers on top of your smokestacks, and that will keep the environment clean. That would be a regulatory solution. Now, another approach would be a Pigouvian tax. So Pigou said, what if we figure out how much cost is being imposed by people and make them pay for that cost through a tax? And we call that kind of a tax a Pigouvian tax, after Pigou. Now, it was a very clever idea. And you could also use it in the form of a subsidy for positive externalities. But the Pigouvian tax has some problems because the money may not get to the people who actually suffered from the cost. Government tends to keep it for itself. So many years ago, a very tiny little British economist named Ronald Coase was at the University of Chicago. Ronald Coase, soft-spoken, he didn't write a lot of papers in his career. In fact, today he wouldn't even be able to get tenure because he only wrote about 8 papers. But he devoted so much effort to these papers. It turns out he got the Nobel Prize because his papers had such an impact on the world. And one of those papers was a paper about negative externalities. And what Ronald Coase said was, negative externalities go two ways. We always think of them as one way, but in fact, both parties are imposing costs on each other. Now, his colleagues, they didn't buy his story, and they were embarrassed that he was going to send this paper out to be published. And so they had a special meeting in the library. They shut the doors. Milton Friedman was there, some other famous economists, and they proceeded to tear into him about this idea, and he needed to stop. And this discussion, you could hear the voices, students who were outside the door listening. After several hours, the doors opened, the economists came out, and little Ronald Coase came out. And when it was over, he had convinced every one of them he was right and they had been wrong. And the Coase theorem came from that paper. And the Coase theorem said, if there are well-defined property rights and full information, and the transaction costs are low, then the two parties should be able to negotiate away the negative externality. And so what the government needs to do is to make sure there's full information, make sure there's well-defined property rights, and to keep the transaction costs low. And then these negative externalities will resolve themselves. He used as an example in his paper the story of a train traveling through a field of corn. Now, the railroad owned the land that the rail was on, and they owned the land on either side, let's say 50 feet on either side. All that empty land, and they thought, kind of stupid to not be growing corn on it. So they went ahead and planted corn. And the railroad didn't care because, they're not using it anyway. So they let the farmers grow corn on it. And then something happened. Some sparks came off the steel wheels of the train, flew out into the field, caught them on fire, and all the corn went up in smoke. Well, they sued the railroad. You caused this fire, railroad, and you destroyed all of our crops. Well, the railroad said, well, that's not our fault. We didn't ask you to plant your corn on our land. Get out of here. So this went to court. And the judge that was over this case also was an economist. And he knew the Coase theorem. And he thought, okay, if I give the property rights to the farmers, that they have the right to plant corn there, then they have a case against the railroad. Now, the railroad's going to have to do something about this. They can either move the railroad, or they can put spark guards over the wheels, or they could pay the farmers to not grow corn there. One of those choices. But what if I give the property rights to the railroad? Now the farmers have to say, maybe we should pay the railroad to put spark guards on their wheels so we can grow corn there. Or maybe we should just not grow corn there. In other words, it just depends on who has the property rights, but they can still negotiate the deal and make it happen. And that's the Coase theorem that I expect you to know. Now, obviously, some negative externalities you can't solve using the Coase theorem because they have high transaction costs, or there's not well-defined property rights, whatever. So, for example, smog in Los Angeles, transaction costs are going to be incredibly high. You're going to sue every driver. And well-defined property rights, the wind is blowing it around. Whose was it? Where did it come from? Hard to know. So, I'm not going to solve every problem, but it can solve many problems. And finally, let's talk about having a stable currency. It's really critical that a currency be stable. People have to be able to rely on it. And the US dollar has always been the gold standard. I mean, it's been the standard by which the rest of the world bases itself. In fact, there are 3 countries who, because they had so much inflation, threw away their money and converted to the US dollar. Ecuador is one of them. I have a brother who lived there for several years. So a good banking system, a strong, stable currency is essential.